Numbers released by Statistics Canada paint a grim picture. Canadian exports to the United States are sliding towards some of the lowest levels in modern history. And tucked inside those numbers is a resource that rarely gets the spotlight, but quietly keeps America's electric revolution alive: nickel. Every single year, around $3.9 billion worth of Canadian nickel makes its way into Detroit. It doesn't come with headlines. It doesn't make campaign ads. But without it, the shiny EVs rolling off American production lines would grind to a halt. Nickel is the quiet engine of America's electric dream. But then came August, and with one stroke of a pen, the man in the White House, once a casino owner, once a reality TV star, now wielding tariff powers like poker chips, decided he knew best how to run a 21st century supply chain. His 20% tariff on electric vehicles was branded as a move against China, but buried inside the policy was a shockwave no one in Ottawa saw coming. It didn't just hit Beijing, it slammed Canada, our closest ally, our next-door neighbor, the country we share hockey nights and Tim Hortons jokes with. No exemptions, no quiet carve-outs, no negotiation across the table, just a tariff wall tall enough to block common sense. And now, Ottawa isn't responding with tweets or hashtags. They're reaching for something much sharper. Because when you strangle the lifeline of North America's battery belt, you shouldn't be surprised when Canada decides to reach for the defibrillator. Or, if pushed far enough, the detonator. Let's rewind. For decades, the nickel corridor from Sudbury, Ontario to Detroit has been the unseen backbone of America's EV ambitions. Not China, not Russia, not Indonesia, Ontario. The numbers are staggering. Every year, 185,000 tons of nickel-copper ore flow south, transformed into more than $3.9 billion worth of cathode material for U.S. battery plants. This isn't a lopsided trade deficit. This is a lifeline, a vein running straight into the heart of America's energy future. But try explaining that to someone who treats trade policy like a round of Monopoly, throwing down tariffs as if they were chance cards. And here's where the story really turns absurd. Let's zoom into the battery itself. Take a typical 86 kilowatt-hour SUV battery pack, built with good old NMC 811 chemistry. Each pack relies on about 38 kilograms of nickel, making up nearly 80% of every cell. Now, nickel isn't cheap. At today's market rate of $20,400 per ton, that nickel alone costs roughly $775 per pack. But with Trump's 30% tariff, there's now an additional $230 slapped onto the bill just for crossing the border. That means each EV battery costs $950 to $1,020 more than it did yesterday. And when you zoom out, that tiny increase per unit slashes GM's projected profit margins from 10.1% down to 8.3%. For Wall Street, that may look like a small dip, but in Detroit boardrooms, those numbers might as well be written in red ink. Because in corporate America, single digits are only loved in one place: tax brackets. And the pain doesn't stop at margins. According to Arena's July simulation, this policy alone is expected to erase 94,000 EV sales in 2026. Think about that. Nearly 100,000 cars vanish from the roads, not because consumers lost interest, not because technology failed, but because of a tariff written on a whim. So let's add this up. We've got a policy branded as pro-America, but what does it actually deliver? Higher costs for consumers, lower profits for automakers, fewer jobs in the EV sector, and a competitive disadvantage for U.S. companies in a global market already dominated by Chinese and European rivals. That's not protectionism, it's sabotage disguised as patriotism. It's like putting a brick on the gas pedal, crashing straight into a wall, and then blaming the brakes for failing. Here's the truth. The battery belt wasn't broken, but someone in the Oval Office thought it needed fixing and reached for a sledgehammer. And while America was swinging wildly, Canada was quietly loading its own weapons. Ottawa wasn't just watching, it was planning. By the end of July, the response was ready. Not a press conference, not empty threats. A four-move playbook. Sharp, strategic. Designed not to shout, but to squeeze. Move 1, a 15% export tax on raw nickel, targeted directly at U.S. cathode producers who, for years, enjoyed duty-free access to Sudbury's nickel. That privilege is gone. So much for the special relationship. Move 2, a carbon tracking system for exported cathode materials. What does that mean? Only Ontario's low-emission nickel, produced with clean hydroelectric power and advanced electrolysis, gets the fast lane under NAFTA rules. Anything dirtier? It takes the slow lane, or gets rerouted to another buyer altogether. If Washington wants America first, Ottawa is more than happy to push best price, cleanest carbon. Move 3, a $257 million Canadian investment fund along the Quebec-Ontario corridor, designed to fast-track LFP battery development. In other words, Canada isn't just defending its turf, it's doubling down, building a parallel system that keeps the supply chain secure while telling American buyers, we don't need you as much as you think we do. That third move, Canada's $257 million investment fund, isn't just a headline number. It's a strategic pivot. The money is fueling the development of LFP batteries, which need far less nickel per cell. Translation: less dependence on any single trade partner and fewer headaches when a president decides to confuse tariffs with strategy. And then comes Ottawa's crown jewel special tax incentives to anchor Stellantis LG's 20 gigawatt-hour cell plant in Windsor. You want jobs? So does Canada. Only now they're playing to win. According to the Canadian Expenditure Office's July 28th memo, these combined measures are projected to redirect more than $1.8 billion in export value away from U.S. buyers and into the open arms of South Korea and the EU by 2027. The messaging couldn't have been clearer. Mark Carney, Canada's economic heavyweight, didn't rage on Twitter. He didn't storm a podium. But behind closed doors, his words cut like a scalpel. Nickel and cobalt are our diamonds. We will not hesitate to play our tax card. And suddenly, the air in Washington's back rooms shifted. Because when you choke a lifeline, you risk it snapping back, with interest. Let's be clear. Ottawa didn't just retaliate. They recalibrated the entire map. They rewired trade routes. They quietly began sending their nickel elsewhere. And the numbers prove it. In the first half of 2025, Canada's nickel sulfate exports surged by 23%. But here's the twist. U.S. market share dropped, while South Korea and Germany stepped forward with contracts in hand and smiles on their faces. While Washington was busy building tariff walls like it was 1930, America's allies were busy signing new delivery schedules. The cleanest nickel in the Western Hemisphere, nickel that once had a direct line to Michigan, was now being boxed up and shipped to Hamburg and Seoul. And what does that leave America's EV industry holding? A dependency on laterite nickel from Indonesia and the Philippines. That's the fast food of minerals, cheap, dirty, and loaded with environmental regrets. Let's talk emissions. Nickel refined in Ontario averages just 4.22 tons of CO2 per ton of metal, thanks to hydropower and electrolysis. Compare that to Indonesia's laterite nickel, which comes with a carbon footprint of 36 tons per ton of metal, nearly 9 times higher. China's nickel is cleaner than Indonesia's, but still heavy, at 18 tons of CO2 for every ton produced. And here's where the policy backfires spectacularly. Starting in 2026, the EU will begin enforcing a carbon border tax of €115 per ton of CO2. Do the math: if US-made EVs rely on dirty Indonesian nickel, every car headed for Europe could be slapped with a massive environmental surcharge before it even leaves the port. So, the policy that was sold as economic protectionism is shaping up to be something else entirely, a diplomatic boomerang, and a green one at that. Because when you chase away your cleanest supplier, you're left holding a bag of dirty nickel, higher costs, and a vehicle that can't cross borders without a climate confession stapled to the paperwork. Meanwhile, somewhere between a closed-door meeting and a campaign fundraiser, Washington is staring down 3 choices, and none of them come with a golden elevator ride. Option 1, carve out a special exemption for Canadian nickel. The 30% tariff stays for everyone else, but Sudbury gets a fast pass. That would preserve the Ontario-Detroit battery lifeline and stop EV plants from hemorrhaging dollars. Option 2, play hardball. No exemptions. Full tariffs. No turning back. But if they choose this path, Canada pulls the trigger. 15% export tax, supply rerouted to Europe and South Korea, and Detroit left scrambling with spreadsheets full of panic and not enough nickel to go around. Option 3, try the middle lane. Drop the tariff to 20 or 25%. Patch up the US-Canada Critical Minerals Alliance, and pray the EU delays its carbon slapback long enough for Detroit to catch its breath. Not perfect, but less like self-sabotage. So how's the market betting? As of July 31st, Analysts give a 60% chance that Washington picks option 1 or 3, and a 40% chance things completely derail. But here's the kicker. GM isn't waiting around. They've already slashed their 2026 EV production forecast from 360,000 units to 310,000. That's a $3.2 billion shortfall, the kind of number that makes investors sweat bullets. And yet, the White House still calls this negotiating. For everyone else, it looks more like forcing your neighbor to sell their car than wondering why your own driveway sits empty. While trade reps shuffle policy papers in air-conditioned boardrooms, everyday Americans are left staring at price tags in dealership showrooms, and those numbers are rising just as fast. Thanks to the 35% tariff and ballooning nickel costs, the F-150 Lightning is projected to hit a sticker price of $72,500 by early 2026. That isn't just high. That's you might as well buy a boat high. Meanwhile, the good old gas-powered F-150 XLT, the truck that has been America's workhorse for decades, suddenly looks like the smarter buy. Over an 8-year ownership cycle, the gas version still holds a 15 to 20% cost advantage. And that's before factoring in carbon surcharges or supply chain chaos. Translation? The electric truck didn't just get more expensive, it got taxed straight into luxury status, while the gas-powered version suddenly looks like the budget-friendly option. Think about that. These tariffs were sold to the public as protection for American workers. But right now, the only thing actually being protected is the profit margin of gasoline consumers. The very voters promised cheaper, cleaner cars are instead being priced out of the EV market entirely. This isn't smart policy. This is shooting your own supply chain in the foot, then handing the bullet to your biggest competitor. While the Biden administration talks about a future where 50% of new car sales are electric by 2030, the reality on the ground looks a lot more like 20% hope, 80% sticker shock. And the man in the West Wing? He's too busy waging tariff wars to notice that America's middle class just got priced out of the green revolution they were promised. So who are EVs really for now? It's not your neighbor down the street, unless, of course, your neighbor runs a hedge fund. And here's the punchline no one in Washington seems to understand. Ontario isn't begging for exemptions. They're printing boarding passes for their nickel shipments. If Sudbury can't send its nickel south, it'll send it east. The European Union is starving for clean mineral supply, and Canada's low-carbon nickel slides perfectly into their Green Deal. Meanwhile, South Korea has already boosted imports from Ontario by 18% since March, according to Canada Trade Monitor's July 2025 report. While Washington builds tariff walls, Ontario is busy building trade bridges. And in this new geopolitical chessboard, Canada isn't a pawn. It's the player controlling the center of the board. Nickel, once dismissed as just another boring element buried underground, has become a geopolitical bargaining chip. And Ottawa? They're holding it with both hands and 2 fingers on the trigger. What we're witnessing here is not Canada losing leverage. It's Canada finally realizing it never needed American approval in the first place. Meanwhile, the man in the West Wing is still staring at a tariff chart like it's a campaign poster. But, spoiler alert, the real game isn't being played in Washington. It's being played in Sudbury. And Ontario? Ontario isn't losing. Ontario is moving on. So here we are, 1 tariff later, and the nickel that once quietly powered America's electric future has transformed into a diplomatic landmine. What used to be a handshake between the closest of allies has now become a negotiation conducted under threat. A $3.9 billion trade artery, once pulsing between Ontario and Detroit, now faces a wall. Not a wall built of bricks, but a wall built out of bad math and worse politics. Nickel, once just a line on the periodic table, now holds the keys to who builds what, where, and at what cost. And if the U.S. loses its grip on Ontario's clean supply, tell me this. Who in their right mind is going to bet billions on building an EV plant in Michigan? Because tariffs don't just raise prices. They raise red flags for investors. And while Washington keeps calling this a win, Canada is moving forward. Europe opens its ports. South Korea signs its contracts. Ottawa lays down its playbook. And America's so-called battery belt, it's slowly bleeding supply. So here's the real question. If the U.S. keeps slamming doors shut on its allies, how long before those allies stop knocking? Or maybe they already have. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to hit subscribe for more sharp, in-depth breakdowns of how global economics and politics collide. Because the nickel story isn't just about a metal, it's about who gets to build the future and who gets left behind.